Thank you, Matt. Hi, everybody. Those were great panels this morning. It's been so nice to see many of my old budget friends here, and special credit to Bill Beach and to Senator Sessions for making this possible, and to the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, Amity Schlaze and Matt Dinhart, and all the others that made this very interesting conference possible. Can we give another round of applause to the panelists? Really interesting panels this morning. Senator Sessions has championed the idea of setting reasonable limits on government and holding the President and Congress accountable for the debt and for the deficit. He's touched several third rails and lived to tell about it. He's advocated finding some reasonable restraints on how the spending in the Veterans Administration goes, in agriculture subsidies, even the defense spending. And knowing Alabama, you know those are three key areas for his state. So how has he done that? He's shown a principled stance on ways to improve the efficiency of spending and to find ways that it can be restrained. And it also helps that he got 100% of the votes that were cast in Alabama in last week's election. Congratulations on that. I see three ways to address this crisis. I'm wearing my green Vermont tie for Calvin Coolidge today. He advocated backbone and personal restraint. Those are critical and they're fine, but this morning we heard about the loss of impoundment authority and the invention of the concept of mandatory appropriations. I've railed against that deterioration in our budget process in my Forbes columns. To me, it means that backbone is necessary, but probably not sufficient to getting the budget back on track. Bill Archer said this morning that Social Security COLA was a backbone issue back then. Remember, before we had a COLA in Social Security, we had unrestrained increases in the Social Security payments. So as we think about backbone, it only gets us so far, in my view. A second way is to wait for a new president who wants to restrain spending. I think that would be a lost opportunity right now. I'm pulling this morning my red suitcase. That signifies the rapidly growing national debt. And CBO projects that deficits will grow rapidly in the out years. So waiting until 2017, to me, would be unfortunate, a lost opportunity. So a third approach that I think can help is to create a national debate now over the size and duties of government. Invite the president, for example, to explain his view on whether there should be any boundaries. Sometimes I think he doesn't want any boundaries on the size of government. We should publicize the debt to GDP ratio and make Americans more aware of that. I think the March debt limit, the coming debt limit increase in March, should include modifications that would move us back towards spending limits or forward towards some spending limits on what the federal government does. Republicans should be asking the president every day, will he propose any spending restraints or entitlement reform in order to create space for his priorities in terms of spending increases. But everyone here knows the challenges. Many of you have led repair efforts. The tax code is severely broken. Regular order in the budget is a distant memory. Even omnibus appropriations bills are a distant memory, replaced by repeated CRs. That causes a static allocation of spending and subtracts from national growth, even though the economy needs dynamic reallocation and rapid change in federal spending. We have a high debt to GDP ratio. Bill Hoagland mentioned this morning because of the Federal Reserve has undertaken $2.8 trillion of interest-bearing liabilities without clear authority, and that ends up putting the Fed into a fiscal responsibility area that it probably shouldn't be in. We have state and local pension funds that don't discuss future outlays. Much of this will find its way onto the federal budget over the years. Alan Schick this morning and others pointed out that the entitlement spending is growing too fast with no workable reform process. And that's yet. So that brings me to Senator Sessions. It's not often that the fate of democracy and free markets hang on the Budget Committee's shoulders, but with spending and debt growing almost without boundaries, it may be hanging on the Budget Committee's shoulders now. Calvin Coolidge didn't like a lot of words, so I'm going to apply that to my final point of introduction of Senator Sessions. Alabama Law School, U.S. Attorney for 12 years, Attorney General of Alabama, now entering his 4th Senate term. If you missed it, he's a strong supporter of armed services and armed forces. If you missed it, Senator Sessions was on Fox News with Megyn Kelly last week, and he showed a great deal of on-air talent as well. He's the ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee and possible chairman in next year of the Senate Budget Committee, and it's my great pleasure for me to introduce Senator Jeff Sessions. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, David, and it is great to be with all of you. I'm sure I didn't get 100% of the votes because Nick Saban and Mickey Mouse got quite a number of votes, there's no doubt, in Alabama. But it is, all in all, it's more preferable to run for office without an opponent than with one. So I do thank you all for that. And I appreciate the panelists that have met here and contributed. I'd like to thank the Coolidge Presidential Foundation and the brilliant Amity Sales for the work you've performed and the public service that you're rendering. It's so important. Calvin Coolidge should be returned to his rightful place among the great presidents. In my remarks today, I'm going to rely on some of Amity's work as we discuss where we are in history, what we've got to do, and the challenge we face. Actually, Amity, your work on Coolidge couldn't come in a better time. So we've strayed far from sound and proven principles to make an economy and a nation strong. We just have. This is the truth as I see it, the way I analyze some of the conditions we face. The American people and the American and world economies are so huge that governments cannot possibly micromanage them. And no economic expert can predict the future. I can show you Alan Greenspan's 2001 testimony before the Budget Committee when he predicted we would pay down the entire debt of the United States and then question what we would do with the money, surplus money after that. It's unbelievable. You need to read the testimony. So I just would tell you that the American concept, the Coolidge view, holds that real power in the economy comes from the drive of millions of energetic citizens doing their best to advance their own family and personal interest. Therefore, we believe it is the primary duty of the government to create a framework in which individuals can pursue their highest dreams and most often achieve them. The idea that there is someone somewhere in the canyons of Wall Street or elsewhere, some special economist who can email to Washington on a weekly basis what we ought to be doing to make the economy better is obviously unwise and can't be done, and just to state the fact reveals its absurdity. Thus, this government, like Coolidge, should simply, I think, dedicate itself to establishing sound policies, the same common sense policies discussed around the kitchen table, and maintained over time. Sound, honorable policies consistent with our national morality will create stability and confidence, and I think that will allow for the greatest prosperity over the long run. One such policy that you've discussed today is that the government live within its means. There's an end to that. One of my favorite economists, and I've quoted her a number of times on the floor of the Senate, is Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music, and that great line, "Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could." As one person told me in Greenville, Alabama, you can't borrow your way out of debt. I think Coolidge would agree with that. So the reason this economy, in my opinion, has been so slow to recover is that many very bright people have promoted aggressive policies that they said would somehow overcome difficulties more rapidly and fix problems. But in truth, these actions, I think, history shows, have hurt the economy. Our recovery is slow. We've lived for 6 years under a policy model of tax, spend, borrow, and regulate. Tax, spend, borrow, and regulate. I suggest that is not the way to create a sound, responsible, long-term economy that prospers. Our surging federal debt now exceeds the nation's entire economic input, our gross debt does, and ominously, interest payments alone last year amounted to $231 billion. How much is that? It's 6 times the federal highway bill of $40 billion. That's a lot of money. Education budget is $100, so we already spent last year $221 billion off the top out of what, 3,000 billion we collect, and that's where we are. In 6 years, CBO tells us that interest on the debt will exceed the entire defense budget, which is about $500 billion. And in 10 years, it's projected to reach $800 billion. So from 200 to 800, $600 billion will be added, we project, to the burdens placed on this American economy before we do the things that government wants to do to make the life better for American people. So enormous are the debts of this country that we'll be spending more to pay our creditors the interest on our debts than we'll be spending on so many of the programs that are important to the American people. So the $800 billion in interest payment, the projected CBO score for the entire federal expenditure 10 years from today is $5.8 trillion. So this is what we're dealing with. I think this is a national calamity. It's one out of every $7 almost taken from the American people and the American economy will be extracted for no benefit, spent on nothing but paying interest. Interest is a burden, a burglar, raiding the income of the next generation to pay for today's reckless living. It just is. It drains the wealth of nations. It's a stealth tax on every working person. Every dollar added to our debt increases these interest payments and hollows out the once prosperous national treasury. What will we say to children of today when they go to work tomorrow and are taxed simply to pay trillions in interest payments that we will owe to the world? No nation can financially sustain such spending. We're told this dangerous borrowing would be good because it would stimulate economic growth. But over the last 4 years, growth has averaged only 2.2% GDP, or about half what the White House projected. Indeed, CBO, the Fed, OMB have all projected about twice the growth that we've achieved in the last few years. That's a stunning miss. And it tells us something about our ability to project the future and what actually will work to make America strong. Every great and wise forecaster, even private sector, overestimated our growth. So I would say with regard to interest, we've never, and some of the programs that we've extended in the last few years, we've never spent more for so little in return. Consider, since 2009, the following occurred. Almost 10 million people left the workforce entirely. We have the lowest percentage of Americans working today since the 1970s. This is a calamity to have this many people, this fewer people working as a percentage of the economy. Real median family incomes have dropped $3,200. Real median weekly earnings are lower today than they were in 2000. Our constituents believe very firmly that we are on the wrong track. We have a jobs crisis, we have an income crisis, and we have a confidence crisis. And if we don't return to sound budgeting principles, we'll soon have a debt crisis. The first duty of lawmakers is to protect the nation from a clear and present danger. Our massive accumulation of debt has placed the country at great risk. Any kind of financial shock, which history tells us frequently and periodically occur, could trigger extreme fiscal repercussions. We just have no margin for an emergency with the debt we have today. Our CBO director, choosing his words very carefully, has said repeatedly that we are on an unsustainable path, a path that he says creates and threatens us with fiscal crisis. The legacy of President Coolidge points the way forward, I think. Coolidge made it a practice to gather his department heads. I think this is a good idea, Amity. When radio was new, twice a year for a public interrogation on the federal budget. He called them in and interrogated them before the American people. It was then that he and Budget Director General Lord would rigorously and publicly question those whose departments spent more than their budgets. He would demand that their budgets be justified and chide anyone publicly who failed to save sufficient dollars. This was broadcast nationwide on radio to the delight of citizens, grateful for a president who championed their interests and protected their dollars. So one of our top goals as a new Republican majority must be to impose financial discipline on every single agency of this government, and we have to be consistent about it. Cities and states have done so. They made major corrections in their spending levels, always to some dire projections that the city would cease to exist, but I'm not sure any of them have ceased to exist. No states, to my knowledge, have sunk into the ocean because they've operated it more fiscally responsible and stopped the waste, fraud, and abuse and tightened up some spending. So in a speech delivered on October 26, 1924, the president said, quote, "The budget idea is a sort of obsession with me. I believe in budgets. I want other people to believe in them. I have had a small one to run my own home, and besides that, I'm the head of the organization that makes the greatest of all budgets, that of the United States government. I regard a good budget as among the noblest monuments of virtue." Close quote. It's integrity. It's morality. It's the right thing to do, and it's good for the economy that we have a budget that's followed and that can create confidence that we have the nation not on an unsustainable path, but on a sustainable path. So the Republican Congress must produce a budget. Failure is not an option. By Coolidge's first year in office, 1924, debt was 4 times larger than in 1917. So the president acted immediately to demand a $300 million reduction in spending, to which all of his departments were expected to contribute. Nothing was sacrosanct. General Lord, the budget director, even found savings by eliminating the red ribbon used to bind the communications by White House to Congress, providing us with the expression, cutting government red tape. Coolidge also instituted a substantial tax reduction from the revenue levels extracted by the Wilson administration, helping to usher in a period of dramatic growth that most benefited working Americans during that period. Coolidge reduced the federal spending from 3.5% of GDP to 3% during his 6 years in office. What are we now, Bill? 20% of GDP. It was 3. He cut it from 3.5 to 3. He also reduced tax rates from a top rate of 77% to a rate of 20%. At the same time, total revenues grew by 60% over that period. We've heard that tax cuts won't create growth and won't enhance revenue. It may not be dollar for dollar, and we have to be cautious about that. But that it is true that abusive tax rates properly configured can increase revenue and actually lower the rates. GDP also shot up by 20% over that period and averaged 4.7% growth per year. We would love to have that today. Unemployment fell from 6.7 to 3.2%. So we've got to apply, I think, Coolidge's spirit to our current times. And here are some of the budget challenges that we face. So we don't really have no long-term financial plan for America, no budget plan that will stick, that we all have unified behind. The outgoing Senate majority has only bothered to introduce one budget since 2009. And we kind of gave them a hard time over that. We used to have charts, with how many days without a budget, and I gave them a hard time. And we loved them all, and they're good people, but they weren't producing a budget. And the law said we're supposed to produce a budget. Only problem was it didn't say you go to jail if you don't produce a budget. It just said produce one. So there was no penalty, and we weren't having one. We got one out of the Democratic Senate. But this time, the Republican House and the Republican Senate are going to have to produce a budget because we've committed to that. And I think the American people expect that of us, and it will not be easy, trust me. But I know Mitch McConnell is the phrase I use, failure is not an option. That's his phrase. I mean, I think it says it well. We haven't passed individual appropriations bills. Some of you mentioned that. So we passed not a single appropriations bill this year. There are 13. They used to be brought up individually, even when I first came here. And there would be on the floor a week or 2 weeks, and amendments would be filed. And I want to save money this way, or I oppose this, or I favor this. And members would vote on it. And that bill would then pass and become law and fund the government. Now, to avoid the problem of having a bill on the floor where amendments can be offered, no bill moves. And they just put them all together in one bill right before the September 30th deadline when the government shuts down, and Congress passes a continuing resolution to fund the entire government basically the way it was before. Just continuing resolution. So this year, no appropriation bill was done. We continued until December 7th. And then we're going to have to pass another continuing resolution, presumably. No individual bills are going to be brought up. That is a fundamental alteration of what the Senate is supposed to be about. This is a fundamental alteration of citizen control and transparency that they can have toward their government. It cannot continue. So we've got some of our big spenders. Some of you probably, I think, talked about this morning, are really good at gimmicks. We tried to offer the Honest Budget Act that stopped a number of the gimmicks, but it does hide the true cost of legislation. Makes many of the spending programs appear to be within the budget when they're really not within the budget. And those gimmicks really need to be eliminated, and we need to proudly say that this Congress is not going to gimmick with the American people. They're going to tell the truth about what their deficits are and what our challenges are. Medicaid and Social Security are being raided by the politicians to pay for other programs. Medicare is a trust fund. At least the first part, part one, and the hospital part, comes off people's paychecks every week. They see it. That's why they think they're entitled to it, because it comes off their paycheck every week. And this is, in many ways, a moral obligation the government owes, because we said we're going to take this money from you every week and we're going to provide you benefits. So what happened with Medicare? Medicare cost cutting occurred in Obamacare, saved several $100 billion. And in a unified budget, it scored as reducing expenditure. That reduced expenditure was then used to fund Obamacare. But you can't simultaneously use the money. This is borrowed money, take Social Security money, and spend it on a new program, any new program for that matter, and expect the budget, the dollars to balance. You can't use the money for two different things at the same time, as CBO told us. in response to my letter December 23rd before the bill passed December 24th. The language the CBO used was, you can't simultaneously use the money in Social Security to strengthen Social Security and fund a new program. So the budget rules are not enforced. We're waiving the budget on a number of occasions. We have no control over the accountable bureaucracy. It tends to be focused on itself and not the needs of the American people. There are 80 different federal welfare programs, spending $750 billion in federal money and another $250 in state money, $1 trillion a year on these 80 programs that are duplicative and not effective. So we need to consolidate and place new emphasis on job creation, placing people in jobs, protecting taxpayers, and better serving the recipients, not just maintaining them, but helping them advance. Instead of defining compassion by how much we spend on poverty, we need to define our compassion by how many people we help lift out of poverty. One of the economic challenges we face today is the combination of high joblessness, low wages, and a shrinking middle class. Well, this is happening out there. You may not know it, but I know it. It's a social, economic, and human disaster. We want all people to see their futures better, not being constricted. So the Harding-Coolidge administration faced similar economic conditions. There had been a great wave of immigration, and so they confronted that. In the 4 decades up to that time, they'd had the greatest surge of immigration we'd ever had. This substantial increase in the labor pool had created a loose labor market that tilted the balance of power to large employers over everyday workers, and the increase in the labor supply, as you know, reduces the price of labor. Increase of import of iron reduces the cost of iron. Coolidge believed it was rational and sensible to swing the pendulum back towards the average wage-earning American. He explained in a speech to naturalized citizens, quote, "We want to keep wages and living conditions good for everyone who is now here or who may come here. As a nation, our first duty must be to those who are already our inhabitants, whether native or immigrants. To them we owe an especial and weighty obligation," close quote. A tightened labor market occurred. Coolidge, as he predicted, it boosted wages for Native Americans and immigrants who had arrived, and allowed them to rise together into the middle class, and that was a period of great expansion of the middle class. By 1970, a second great wave of immigration was underway and has continued its rapid growth through to the present. Immigration levels are at record high, with 41.3 million U.S. residents born in another country. So a new challenge is the advance of robotics and computers. I travel my state, and I see factories. Every one of them are seeking to use more robots and more computer and more simplification of their processes, which means less jobs for people. Combined with increased globalization, these forces are further reducing wages and making it more irrational to bring in very large numbers of low-wage workers from abroad. We need to help people get off welfare and off unemployment and into good-paying jobs. That is the nation's mission. That's our duty, our responsibility. But I do think the immigration bill championed by the president doubles the rate of foreign guest workers who are brought into the country. So what sense does it make to spend billions sustaining Americans on welfare while bringing in millions of low-wage workers to fill jobs in their place? Doesn't it make more sense to use the welfare office instead of the immigration office as a job placement center? Well, we need to transition millions of struggling Americans to jobs, strengthening families, uplifting the communities, and honoring, as Coolidge did, the innate dignity of work. Across the board, we need an economic strategy to get Americans back to work without adding to the debt. Here's some ways that we can create growth, prosperity, get people working without adding to the debt. Isn't that our national imperative? Produce more American energy, creating jobs here at home in the course of that, making business expenses less and allowing them to expand. Make our tax code more simple, more competitive, and more growth-oriented. So this is the best place in the world to expand and hire. Eliminate all unnecessary regulations, and there are thousands of them. They adversely impact our economy. They hurt production. They hurt hiring. It sends jobs overseas. We need to resolutely make the government leaner and more efficient. The government extracts a huge amount of wealth from the American people. They have every right to expect it runs lean and be productive and to serve their interest, produce more good for less dollars. We need to apply the business principle to our government. We need to turn the welfare office into an employment office. We need to stand up to countries, in my opinion, that violate their trade agreements with the United States. I've always supported trade and believed in trade and believe in trade. But our trading partners expect us to comply with the rules, and we need to expect them to comply with the rules. We don't need to lose a single job to unfair trade competition from abroad. We need to enforce an immigration policy that tightens the labor market and helps wages go up instead of down. We repeal Obamacare, which has hurt businesses, it hurt workers, it's driven people to part-time work, and hurt the economy by almost any expert. We need to balance the federal budget. That's the way to create confidence and stability in the future. It can be done. It won't be easy, but it can be done. So I would just say this. We've got to explain, and you need to help, the dangers of a debt crisis. You need to, because you have more credibility than politicians, you need to talk about the dangers that we're operating in, the trajectory that we're on, and help us politicians and put the heat on us to come forward with plans that will work. I believe that we can honor Social Security. We have to. I believe we can honor the Medicare commitments that we have. We have to. And bring this budget under control at the same time. We can be smart about it and do the right things, and that will work. If we do so, the American people will respect that. We need to look them in the eye and say, we're going to fix your Social Security. You can go to bed at night and know for the next 50 years you're going to be able to receive the pension benefits that you've paid into all your working life. And that's the kind of message that will create open ears and make people listen and help us figure out a way to reduce spending and get this country on a right path. So these are steps I've outlined I think will restore some humility to Washington. We're not able to do everything. We're not geniuses. We spend a little here and cut a little here. We do a regulation here, a tax there, and we think that's going to change this massive economy. I think not. I believe the government should give and produce for the American people an honorable economic system that creates a framework that allows people to prosper. So we've had a government over the last number of years that's, I think, lost sight of sound principles, common sense in what we do. The elites have had their day too often. It's time for the middle class to have their day. A new Senate majority must represent middle America. It must be rooted in the values and wisdom of faithful and patriotic Americans. The social and economic center of American life is not Washington, D.C., or Wall Street, or Martha's Vineyard. The social and economic center of American life must be the everyday working people. The time has come for a humble and honest populism, not the cheap demagoguery of political operatives, but a sincere devotion to the legitimate interests of the American people, the populace. a billionaire activist has just one vote. It's no greater than the plumber or the truck driver in Alabama. The vote, so they're just as valuable. It's time to place our emphasis squarely on the needs of good and decent citizens who fight our wars and pay our taxes, follow the rules, and give their love and loyalty to their country, who go to work every day and give a day's work for a day's pay. We in elected office must return to them our loyalty, pledge always to put their interest first, not special interests, not financial contributors. And I think this is a moral pact, a bond that we have with the American people. If they think that we're doing that, we can ask them to sacrifice. If they think they're being asked to sacrifice to advance some special interest somewhere, you can't have the support that you need. And at the center of that pact is the full and equal protection of our laws and enforcement of our classic constitutional heritage. So we will be worthy of this moment, I predict. In history, those of us now leading the Congress will honor and serve the legitimate and long-term interests of more than 300 million Americans we serve, and we will preserve and protect our children and their heritage of Republican government grounded in liberty and law and prosperity. Failure is not an option. Thank you all. God bless. Thank you.
Say this without a mic. This is a present for Senator Sessions, wow. For President Coolidge. Your tall to us and to Coolidge that you would give this time and speak so frankly. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good.
Thank you, Senator Sessions, for that wonderful address. Much to think about, and a call to action, I think, for this room from you. This room is a lot of experts who have been working on this issue and budget issues for decades and decades, and so thank you. We'll now have a short address from David Walker. David will give us some reactions to the Senator's speech. David has his own long career, spanning 40 years in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He's a CPA. I think Coolidge would like accountants. He was a public trustee of the Social Security Trust in the early 1990s. Of course, as all you know, the former Comptroller General of the United States, heading the GAO from 1998 to 2008. Since leaving, he's led the Peterson Foundation and also started the Come Back America initiative. So please welcome David Walker.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate having the opportunity to make some remarks. I want to thank the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. Senator Sessions also, I think, had something to do with it. I think it's appropriate that you have that hat that you were presented, because I've been asked to provide some comments about your remarks as well as the prior panels. And I was going to start off with the fact that I've had the good fortune to wear many hats in my lifetime. And so I'm going to provide you a little perspective from those hats and then talk about where I think we can go from here. The first hat, Senator Sessions and I, who I hope to be able to call Chairman Sessions next year, Senator Sessions and I were both born in Alabama. And when I was born in Alabama, about the only thing that Alabama had going for it was the University of Alabama football. So my first hat is a University of Alabama hat, which is in my suitcase, and I'm happy to show it to you, Senator, if you want to see it. But on a more serious note, I've had the good fortune to wear a number of other hats during my lifetime. First, as a student of history and a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, I know that the U.S. government has strayed from the principles and values that made it great, and the Senator talked about some. Limited but effective government, individual liberty and opportunity, personal responsibility and accountability, rule of law and equal justice under the law, fiscal responsibility and intergenerational equity, and stewardship. The truth is, we've strayed from all of those principles and values, and it's important that we come back to them if we want our future to be better than our past. From a numbers standpoint, 100 years ago, the federal government was 2% of the U.S. economy. Total federal spending was 2% of the economy. Now it's 23. Stated differently, the federal government is 11.5 times bigger than it was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, the federal government controlled 97% of all annual spending. Stated differently, only 3% was so-called mandatory spending, and that was interest on the debt. What about this year? 66% is on autopilot, mandatory spending. So mandatory spending has jumped 22 times in the last 100 years and continues to grow. From George Washington, our first president, to William Jefferson Clinton, the last president who appointed me to a position, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush did, but prior to that, from George Washington to William Jefferson Clinton, federal debt accumulated to $5.3 trillion. Now it's $18.9 trillion, over triple under 2 presidents. As a former Comptroller General of the United States and Social Security and Medicare trustee, I know that the amount of debt and unfunded obligations that are off the balance sheet are 3 times higher than the amount of debt that is on the balance sheet, and those represent future deficits and debt absent a change in course. As a member of the Trilateral Commission, I know that Canada has 1/3 the debt to GDP that we have. Stated differently, we have 3 times debt to GDP that they have on total debt to GDP, and theirs is going down and ours is going up. As one of many budget experts in this room now and earlier this morning, I know that the recent decline in the budget deficit from $1.4 trillion to roughly $500 billion is not due to intelligent decisions about the structural drivers of our long-term deficits. They haven't dealt with demographics, they haven't dealt with health care costs effectively, and they haven't dealt with an outdated and uncompetitive tax system. As a CPA, I know that how you keep score counts. And the way that we keep score with regard to our financial condition and our fiscal outlook at the federal, state, and local level needs major reforms. It does not provide a full and fair view of where we are, where we're headed, and how we compare to others. As a person with contacts on both sides of the political aisle, and also somebody who's been to all 50 states engaging the public on the facts, the truth, the tough choices, and possible ways to solve our budget challenges, I know that Washington is tired of gridlock. I know that the people are tired of gridlock in Washington. They want to see real results rather than more rhetoric in connection with the budget, health care, tax reform, immigration, infrastructure, energy, the environment, and Fed reforms as well. As a former head of the Comeback America initiative, I know that the American people know we're in trouble. They know you can't spend more money than you make, charge it to the credit card, and not recognize that there's not going to be a day of reckoning. They're willing to accept tough choices if they're part of a principle and value-based compromise that they deem to be fair. And I found that through going through 27 states in 2012, including forums, town hall forums with representative groups of citizens from 2 swing states, where 97% said that we're on an imprudent and unsustainable fiscal path and that we need to act sooner rather than later. 92% agreed on 6 principles and values for a comprehensive reform of our nation's finances. 85% said it was going to take at least 3-to-1 spending reductions to revenue increases to achieve that equitable compromise. And 77 to 92% agreed on specific reforms to the budget process, to Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, health care, defense spending, government organization and operations, and political reforms. It only takes 60% in the Senate. And yet 77 to 92% of the American people were willing to agree on a range of structural reforms. That tells us something. We have to go about trying to achieve these reforms in a fundamentally different way. We've got to state the facts. We've got to speak the truth. We've got to talk about the tough choices. We need to bring people together around a set of principles and values that are timeless, that our country, frankly, was created on, and we can achieve principle-based compromise that will move us forward. The truth is, in my opinion, government has grown too big, promised too much, and needs to restructure. And that we are afflicted in this city in particular with three afflictions: myopia, tunnel vision, and self-interest. So the fact is that where do we go from here? The first thing we have to do is to recognize that the country has been in business for 225 years, and we still have no plan. There's no strategic, forward-looking, threat, risk, opportunity-based, outcome-oriented, resource-constrained plan. Now, you may not want to rush into doing something like that, but I would respectfully suggest 225 years is enough. And I would also respectfully suggest that if you don't have such a plan, if you're not focused on outcomes, then all government can do to show that it cares is to spend more money, give a new tax preference, issue a new regulation, create a new entity, anoint a new czar. Now, what about the budget? Well, from a budget standpoint, based upon the comments from the Senator as well as this morning, I think there are a number of things that need to be considered. First, we need to have a level one committee. A level one committee for the budget. If you can't put your finances in order, you're not going to be strong economically at home. If you're not strong economically at home, you're not going to generate opportunities for our citizens. You're not going to have the same strength overseas with regard to foreign policy. It starts with getting your finances in order. We need a level one committee for the budget. Secondly, with regard to the framework, I would respectfully suggest, since Congress has only passed a timely budget and appropriations bills 4 times in my lifetime, yes, you heard that right, 4 times in my lifetime, I would respectfully suggest that we ought to do with a lot of what the states have done and move to biennial budgeting. You can have mechanisms in between to make adjustments. Let's go to biennial budgeting. We need to have everything visible on the budget, including tax preferences and regulatory impact. We spend $1.1 trillion a year. They're not in the budget. They're not in the financial statements. They're not automatically reviewed and reconsidered. They need to be. They need to be. That's a lot of money. And it's backdoor spending. Tax preferences are backdoor spending. Regulatory impact needs to be assessed as well. We need an operational budget and a capital budget. They are fundamentally different. We need to start a baseline with what we spent last year, less what the non-recurring items are. That's where you ought to start budgeting for the next biennium. We need to restore integrity to trust funds. In government, we have trust funds. You can't trust them. They're not funded. Or if they are funded, they're funded with debt, okay? With regard to goals, our goals should be to balance the operating budget and to focus on trying to help achieve a stated debt to GDP target by a year certain. For example, 60% of debt to GDP by 2030 to 2035, and to be on a path to keep it there over time, which will force you to have to deal with some of these mandatory spending programs, the demographic trends, the health care cost, as well as our outdated tax system. And by focusing on debt to GDP, you can focus on pro-growth policies that will grow the denominator faster than the numerator and restore fiscal responsibility to constrain the growth of the numerator. Keep in mind, at the end of World War II, we had 122% of debt to GDP. We went down to the 30 percentile range by around 1980, and we didn't pay off a dime of debt. We did it through bringing back fiscal responsibility to the numerator and growing the denominator such that the relative burden declined. Now, we're not going to do that again because our position in the world, our demographics, the nature and scope of the budget is different. We're going to have to make some tough choices, but we want to have incentives that encourage growth, that promote fiscal responsibility, and focus on really what matters, and I would respectfully suggest that's debt to GDP. On timing, the Congress should have to pass a budget and timely appropriations bills on time, or they shouldn't get paid until they do. And no retroactive pay. No retroactive pay. Look, it is the most fundamental thing. It's the most fundamental thing that you have to do. And we ought to do, and I thought I heard the senator say something along those lines, all right? And believe me, not all senators are wealthy. I know that. The senator knows that. And so, we've got to put our money where our mouth is. With regard to enforcement mechanisms, we need to think outside the box. I mean, maybe what we need to do is we ought to freeze spending and indexing. Freeze the indexing of the tax code, freeze the indexing of cost of living for Social Security and other things. You can't have 2/3 of the budget exempt. You can't have the revenue side exempt. The other thing that we ought to be thinking about is that what do people look at every year, once a year for sure, on a not a good day, April 15th typically, and that's your tax return. And what can we do to try to make sure that to the extent that there's a failure, that it's visible to the American people? That maybe that there's a line on there that's either a surcharge or a dividend, a rebate, depending upon what the nature of the decisions are in Washington, D.C., to make this thing more transparent to more Americans so that they will understand the potential consequences and care more about this, because they clearly don't now. With regard to certifications, I would respectfully suggest that the GAO is the right organization to do that. CBO could clearly do it, but the Comptroller General of the United States has more political independence because they're appointed for a 15-year term, can only be removed by impeachment or joint resolution of Congress for specified reasons. And so therefore, I think you get a little bit of more independence from the budget process and a little bit more independence from potential retribution by the Congress, if you will, or other parties. On presidential authority, we need enhanced rescission authority. We need enhanced line item veto. And what are some other things that we need? We ought to be looking at the Inform Act which would provide for disclosures of the long-term implications of short-term budget decisions, looking at discounted present value numbers with regard to some of these social insurance programs. I don't like to call them entitlement programs because I think that's part of the problem. The words you use matter. They're social insurance programs. Keep in mind, there's only two things guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States. Two, debt of the United States government, whether it's public debt or debt held in the trust funds, and pensions associated with Union Civil War veterans. Somehow they didn't cover our pensions, Senator, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is Social Security is not guaranteed, Medicare is not guaranteed, nothing else is guaranteed. And so the fact of the matter is that while we obviously want to honor our commitments, we have to restructure some of those in order to make them solvent, sustainable, secure. We also need to think about what can be done to create a domestic BRAC, to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff between which programs are working, which ones aren't, which ones need to be consolidated, which ones need to be modified, and there's something called the Government Transformation Initiative that is focusing on that to try to make that a reality. In summary, we live in a great country, probably the greatest in the history of mankind. We're not as great as we think we are. We've got some real challenges. We've strayed from the principles and values that made it great. We need to come back to it. We got to get our finances in order. If you don't put your finances in order, everybody and everything is going to suffer to differing degrees over time. With the new Congress, we have an opportunity to engage in principle-based compromise where hopefully the House and the Senate can work together, send some bills to the President for his signature or veto, hopefully signature, that employs Ronald Reagan's approach. Let's get 70%. Let's get 70% and live to fight another day. You know, when you have large known and growing problems that get worse with the passage of time, gridlock is unacceptable. We need to work together to make some progress for all of our benefit, but more importantly, for the benefit of our children and grandchildren. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and thank you to all. The title of our event is, as Amity highlighted in the morning, you saw on our poster throughout the day, is the Virtuous Obsession, how better budget law is key to meeting our fiscal challenges. And we know that it's a little not totally intuitive title, but we think it's very fitting. And Senator Sessions said it best when he quoted Coolidge. And he said, the budget idea, I may admit, is a sort of obsession with me. So that's where the obsession part comes from. I believe in budgets, and I want other people to believe in them. Well, what's so virtuous about budgeting? We really do think that it's a virtue. As Maurice McTeague said, a budget is a strategic document where we as a people come together to signal what direction we want our government to take. And so in that way, when Coolidge said, I regard a good budget as among the noblest monuments of virtue, and it's deserving of all emulation, that was something that I think was very wise and good for us to keep in mind today. Throughout the day, we heard many different ideas, many different solutions, many different takes on how we've arrived to the situation we're at today. We heard the Congressional Budget Office called a skunk, but then we also heard it as backed up as something that creates a check on the OMB and a great balance of power. And then, of course, we heard so many solutions. I think one thing we did hear throughout the day, again and again, that really stuck with me was that something Bill Hoagland said, we must have the political will. And before that, Chairman Archer said, we must have a cultural shift. They were saying we need the same thing. We need to care about budgeting again in this country. We've heard a lot about how we need to care for the young people. Well, I think the young people need a bit of an example themselves. Recent data shows that in the last couple of years, people under the age of 35 have a negative 2% savings rate. That means they're going into debt. And of course, some of that's student loans, but some of it is that they don't have that value of saving that's so important for their future and for our countries. So I think if we achieved anything today, it was bringing together a wonderful group of budget experts, of wonderful speakers, Senator Sessions, Mr. Walker, to start creating that political will and hopefully some of that cultural shift. Coolidge knew that better than anyone, and we did hear today that, well, Coolidge's budgets maybe were a little easier to balance because he didn't have to encounter entitlements, but something that Governor Jim Douglas reminded us was maybe the best lesson for today from Coolidge was that Coolidge was serious about the budget, and even so, he won and was very popular in his time, and we think that's probably possible today. So we have the ideas. It's time for the political will and for the cultural shift, and that's what comes next. The Coolidge Foundation is very pleased to be able to convene this group. There are a number of people that we'd like to thank. Senator Sessions, he had to get off to another engagement, but we thank him. He was the honorary co-host of this entire event, so he was not just a speaker, but was really the moving force behind the event. We'd like to thank his personal staff who helped him make arrangements, helped him make the time in his busy schedule to be involved in the conference. We'd especially like to thank the Senate Budget Committee. I think this conference came out of a discussion primarily with Bill Beach, the chief economist at the Budget Committee back in late March, and Bill, along with Baker Spring and Andrew Logan and Kim Proctor and Eric Chalmers and no doubt several others that I don't even know about, lended a big hand to make this happen. So I would like a round of applause for Bill Beach and the Budget Committee. I'd like to thank all of our speakers and all their organizations as well. We know that making it to these events can be difficult, and you guys were all so well prepared and made this event the success that it was. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Ensema Global, and David Malpass. David, thank you. If you like the lunch, thank David. Beyond our speakers and everyone else in attendance, we had a couple student groups, which I think really helped frame this event well. A number of people pointed to the students and said, this is why this is important. We had our Archer Fellows here, or they might have had to leave, but thank you to the Archer Fellows. We have a group from Ohio University here as well. Thank you for coming and making that trip. We have a number of trustees from the Coolidge Foundation. Of course, Amity Schley's, our chairman, is here. Heidi Eldred and Shriver Sargent's floating around, and of course, Governor Jim Douglas. Thank you for your support. And to our staff, Rashad Thomas. Where's Rashad? He's probably working. Oh, and I'm sorry, and oh my gosh, and I had him in a separate category, one of our trustees. He's the great-grandson of President Coolidge. Chris Jeter is here, and his father, Edward. Thank you for coming down from Connecticut, Chris and Edward. Rashad Thomas from our staff did incredible work. Rebecca Sears is here and has been helping out all day. And especially Rachel Vilwalk, who is our boots on the ground here in D.C., helping us. We're based in Vermont, and Rachel was our eyes and ears and our worker bee here in D.C. So we hope you had a wonderful time today. Thank you for welcoming Coolidge and our foundation here to Washington. We hope to see you again very soon. We hope you'll keep in touch with us. Our website is coolidgefoundation.org. And until next time, we'll say thank you and take care.